Recently, I've come across this video by our friends over at PragerU entitled The War on Cars. Myself being European and a major advocate for public transit, this naturally piqued my interest. What does PragerU, a terminally American organization, have to say about car traffic?
There is a war against cars in America. Regulators want Americans out of cars and onto trains, buses and bicycles. Why? Because of what cars represent. Freedom.
And this type of content follows a longer trend within PragerU. Seems like there's a war on everything nowadays. The war on work, the war on boys, the war on Christmas, and now the war on cars. Leftists are the real snowflakes, by the way. So let's take a look at the war on cars. Through the video, they make 7 relevant arguments. These are as follows. 1. Cars are central to American culture because they provide freedom. 2. Car culture is dying because of government. 3. Government and environmentalists hate personal freedom and want you out of the car. 4. Instead of government enforcing fuel efficiency, it should have been left up to the free market. 5. Urban planners are building bike lanes, reducing parking spots, and investing in public transit, and this is a bad thing. 6. Despite government meddling, low gas prices encourage people to drive more and buy bigger vehicles, and this is a good thing. 7. Car ownership builds cohesion and brings the country closer together. Alright, so these are PragerU's main arguments. And, coincidentally, all of them are horrendously stupid. What's worse, they showcase a fundamental misunderstanding of the concept of freedom from PragerU's part, which is kind of ironic. So let's get right into it, shall we? Point number 1. Cars are central to American culture because they provide freedom.
Ever since Henry Ford built the Model T, cars have been central to the American experience. That's because cars are more than just another way to get from point A to point B. They allow us to go wherever we want, whenever we want, with whomever we want. Think about it. With trains, planes, and buses, the routes are planned, and the schedule is timed. Only cars allow you to be spontaneous. When you get behind the wheel, you are in control. You are free. Americans are explorers. We value our independence, and we've never been good at staying put or being told where to go and at what time.
Now, referring to culture is not a good argument. There are plenty of things that are part of culture which aren't necessarily good. For example, the Taliban can say that subjugating women is part of their culture, therefore they are opposed to women's rights. Would anyone take an argument like this seriously? Would Lauren here be okay with wearing a burqa? Of course not. Just because something is part of culture, it doesn't make it automatically good. But of course the real argument they are making here, the real problem this lady and PragerU have, is that culture is changing. Car culture seems to be on the way out in certain areas of the US, or at least it's receding a little bit, and conservatives find this scary. Besides, the only reason cars became such an integral part of American culture is because car manufacturers successfully lobbied the government in favor of their own interests. American cities were not built for cars originally, not even in the West. They did get demolished for cars though, where entire neighborhoods were bulldozed to make way for urban freeways, which in the end flooded the inner cities with cars, which in turn demolished further buildings to make way for more lanes and more parking spaces. And this was of course a terrible decision. When it comes to livability, most US cities rank from lackluster to just bad. It's no coincidence that all of the most livable cities on the planet are oriented towards public transit and pedestrians. In fact, I would call obsession with cars a cancer of American culture, one that makes life objectively worse for people compared to other countries. Let's move on to the second point. Car culture is dying because of government.
We may be witnessing the death of America's car culture, and it's not dying of old age. People are still buying lots of cars. But there's been a concerted push by government bureaucrats and environmentalists to transform car ownership from a source of pride to a source of guilt.
Now, this kind of argumentation is of course part of a wider PragerU narrative, as in,
one line, government is not the solution to our problems, it is the problem.
But do keep in mind that PragerU's funding comes in large part from fossil fuel billionaires, whose rational self-interest dictates that they help spread misinformation that can lead to the loosening of government regulations, thus increasing their power and consequently their wealth. And this is one of the reasons why I find PragerU so fascinating, their audience anyway. Their narrative is that a shadowy cabal of leftists, or Jews depending on who you ask, are influencing the media and social networks and academia. You can't trust anything coming from those sources, but PragerU, funded by fossil fuel billionaires, well, that's where I get my unbiased information from. So is car culture in the US dying because of government? No. In reality, car use and car ownership are on a downward trend in some places in the US because a lot of people realize that it's just not nice to live in a congested city. All the noise, the pollution, the safety concerns, all the space that cars take up, not to mention the costs of having to maintain a car to commute to work. It's just not nice, so people don't do it if they don't have to. So let's move on to point number 3. Government and environmentalists hate personal freedom and want you out of the car.
The very reason people love cars, personal freedom, is also why regulators can't stand them. Government at all levels craves control, and when it comes to your car, they want you off the road. So do the environmentalists, with whom they have made common cause.
Now this ties heavily into the previous point, but I wanted to address it separately because this point showcases how PragerU fundamentally misunderstands the concept of personal freedom, which is, pretty amazing. So let's perform a brief thought experiment. Imagine that you are in the desert. There's nobody else around, just you. That means nobody can tell you what to do. Theoretically, you are free to do whatever you want. You have absolute freedom. Sounds good, right? In practice, however, your freedom is severely limited by your circumstances, to the point where the only thing you'll be able to do is stumble around in the hot sand for a few hours until you die of thirst. And if you live in an urban desert, like an American suburb, if you want to get to work in the morning, theoretically, you are free to choose any transportation method that you want, which in this case, aside from cars, is either walking or biking, because there's no public transit. But in practice, you cannot take anything other than your car, because traffic makes walking and biking incredibly dangerous, and it would take you 3 hours to get to your workplace. Because turns out freedom is not this monolithic thing with an on-off switch. There are actually 2 types of freedom, PragerU: positive and negative. Negative freedom is when you are free from outside influences. For example, when you are free from government regulations, free from having to subsidize public transit through taxation, and so on. Positive freedom, on the other hand, is when you are provided with options from which you are free to choose. For example, in Europe, due to the excellent, publicly funded infrastructure, I am free to decide how I want to get to work. Do I want to cycle? Do I want to take the bus? Do I want to take the train? In many cases, I can even take my car to work. I mean, it's possible, but more complicated and costly. More on that later. In other words, negative freedom is freedom from something, and positive freedom is freedom for something. And the folks at PragerU, bless their hearts, regularly act like negative freedom is the end-all be-all. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of freedom. If you are theoretically free to take any transportation methods that you want, but in reality, due to your circumstances, you can only take your car realistically, then you don't really have any freedom, do you? And with that, let's move on to point number 4. Instead of government enforcing fuel efficiency, it should be left up to the free market.
This antagonism toward America's car culture can be traced back to the 1970s. In response to the Arab oil embargo in the early part of that decade, Congress passed the National Fuel Economy Standards for cars and light trucks. These standards, known as CAFE, short for Corporate Average Fuel Economy, forced automakers to increase fuel efficiency. Rather than let the free market decide what kind of cars customers wanted to buy, the government decided to do the dictating. Their regulations have cost car companies and consumers many billions of dollars. But in the last decade or so, the government's heavy hand has come down harder than ever. Beginning in 2009, the Obama administration sought to dramatically increase CAFE requirements. These Obama-era standards make cars more expensive, around $4,000 per new vehicle, according to economists Salim Firth and David Kreutzer. According to economists Salim Firth and David Kreutzer. According to economists Salim Firth and David Kreutzer.
Now, especially when it comes to the environment, letting the free market loose usually makes things worse. And to me, the fact that the pro-business center-right Obama administration had to intervene and tighten fuel efficiency regulations is proof in itself that it was justified. It means that the free market either wouldn't solve the problem or would have solved it way too slowly. But in light of the accelerating climate change we have currently, fuel efficiency is necessary and the least we can do. But of course, in the world of PragerU,
government is not the solution to our problems, it is the problem.
Point number 5 is that urban planners are building bike lanes, reducing parking spots, and investing in public transit, and this is a bad thing.
Still, the regulators, bureaucrats, and environmentalists persist. Urban planners are adding bike lanes, reducing parking spots, and pouring billions into more public transportation. all to get people out of their cars. Former Boston Mayor Tom Menino once declared, "The car is no longer king," before banning all cars in a popular downtown shopping district. Arlington, Virginia, a suburb of D.C., actually encourages people to adopt a car-free diet and live in one of the county's urban villages. Seattle, meanwhile, plans to aggressively discourage driving by limiting parking spots, even though cars are an unavoidable part of work and life for most people, according to the Seattle Times. Time will tell if these regulations and strategies will work.
So as far as I'm concerned, this is just another episode of conservatism versus reality. I mean, how lost do you have to be to think that these things are bad? Once again, the existence of Europe proves you wrong. European cities built out bike lanes, reduced parking spots, and invested heavily in public transit, and they are objectively better for it. They are more livable. But of course, these PragerU types will not let facts interfere with their thought process. It's the exact same story as with universal healthcare. Oh, that would never work. That's impossible. We can't simply fund a system like that as the richest country on the planet. And then people point out that every single European country has a functioning universal healthcare system that deliver objectively better results than the US healthcare system for less money. And to that you usually get responses like, yeah, well, that's because Europe is white. But to circle back to PragerU's point, I have to ask, why is PragerU so anti-small business? Small businesses benefit from decongestion. If you take cars off a street and make it more pleasant to walk and plan things out correctly, businesses on that street will make more money. And to quote this study from 1993 titled Impact of Pedestrianization and Traffic Calming on Retailing, a review of evidence from Germany and the UK, Germany has implemented many ambitious pedestrianization and traffic calming schemes over the last 20 years and has carried out quite large-scale research studies on their effect on retailing. The schemes implemented in the UK and the research carried out on them have been more modest. However, they broadly show the same picture. There is generally a positive effect on retailing, with shops inside pedestrian areas being more successful than those outside. And the exact same trends seem to emerge in the US, especially during the COVID epidemic and its closures, with places like Little Italy in Boston seeing a consumer activity increase by as much as 61%. If you want to learn more about the economic effects of decongestion, then just Google it. And I don't know about you, but I'm frankly sick and tired of these loud and aggressive minorities coming in from a different area who take over your neighborhoods and try to dictate how you should live your life. That's right, lady. I'm talking about your kind. Drivers. How come these people who don't even live there can barge into an area and hog all the public spaces, or even have entire buildings demolished to make way for parking lots? And if you dare bringing this up to them, they get all triggered and start screaming at you about how you're a communist and hate America and freedom. A bunch of snowflakes. And so point number 6 on PragerU's big brain list: despite government meddling, low gas prices encourage people to drive more and buy bigger vehicles, and this is a good thing.
Maybe that's why, despite the government's best-laid plans, sales of trucks and SUVs are breaking records as low gasoline prices inspire people to drive more and buy bigger vehicles. Why shouldn't they?
So I've looked up fuel prices and holy shit, gas costs almost half as much in the US compared to Germany where I live. According to this Quartz article, this adds up to Americans paying the second lowest price for gasoline among major world economies. And why is that? Is it because of the free market's brilliant innovations bringing us low prices? Of course not. It's because of billions of dollars of subsidies to the oil sector. And wow, if you think about it, what a historic event this is. Conservatives wanting to subsidize something that's black? But the problem is that these subsidies produce this vicious circle type situation. If you're subsidizing fuel prices, the economy will be more and more dependent on cars. And that means you have to keep pumping those subsidies, because if you stop, you risk causing an economic collapse. In other words, through some divine irony, all these freedom-shouting, car-centric conservatives are welfare queens, with the taxpayers subsidizing their lifestyles. And how nice is that? And so PragerU's 7th point is, car ownership builds cohesion and brings the country closer together.
Personal car ownership is part of America's fabric. It brings people together and makes this big country of ours seem a little smaller and more free. America's car culture isn't dead yet. So as long as Americans still want to live in the land of the free, America's car culture will never die.
And here I'd like to recommend a video from the YouTube user Not Just Bikes titled "Why We Won't Raise Our Kids in Suburbia and Moved to the Netherlands Instead." It's some great content describing how car-centric areas propagate the atomization of society, which is the opposite of bringing people together. I don't want to belabor this point too much because you can just go and watch the video, it's great. But I'll say this much: car-centric areas are generally not dense. People are spread thin. And there's nothing you can do locally, really. You have to go to the nearest strip mall, which is 15 minutes away by car. And even there isn't really any community space, there's just a big parking lot and some stores. In a European settlement, on the other hand, the place has a definite center. A place to go, a place to hang out, a place that is reachable by bike or on foot, because everything is close by, because the settlement is compact, because it wasn't built around cars. In a place like this, on the other hand, an American suburb, where do you hang out? Where do you go? Yeah, would you like to go and hang out on this nondescript street or that one? Hey, let's check out that dead patch of grass in the upper left corner. Or do you prefer to stand next to the arterial road instead? These areas do everything but bring people closer together. They atomize society. In areas like this, you either stay home or go somewhere else to do things. If you want to build cohesion and bring people closer together, car-centric areas are the exact opposite of what you need. We need human-centric, walkable settlements, and we need them now. And no, there is no war on cars in the US, but I wish there was. American cities would objectively be better for it. Thank you for watching, and yeah, PragerU is still pretty dumb. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, check out my Patreon, and I'll be seeing you next time.
Genocides are a solution to our problems.